Welcome to History Teller YT. Imagine a city that ruled the known world. A city of marble temples, roaring crowds, imperial power, and ancient gods. Now imagine that city burning, street by street, home by home, temple by temple, while fear, rumor, and suspicion spread faster than the flames. In the year 64 CE, Rome did not just catch fire. Power burned. Trust burned. Faith was born in fire. This is not just the story of a disaster. This is the story of an emperor whose name would become synonymous with tyranny. A ruler accused of watching his own city burn while pursuing art, glory, and control. A fire that destroyed homes, but also reshaped politics, religion, and civilization itself. Did Emperor Nero truly order the Great Fire of Rome? Or was he a ruler trapped by rumor, fear, and history's judgment? Why were Christians blamed, tortured, and executed? And how did that persecution help create one of the most powerful belief systems the world has ever known? This is a story about leadership under crisis, about how disasters reveal truth, and about how memory outlives monuments. From the flames of Rome, to the fall of an emperor, from persecution to the rise of Christianity, this is the complete story of the Great Fire of Rome. A fire that still burns in our language, our politics, and our understanding of power. Stay with History Teller YT, because this is not just history you will hear. This is history you will feel. By the year 64 CE, Rome stood as the undisputed center of the Mediterranean world, a city that symbolized both extraordinary achievement and profound instability. As the capital of the Roman Empire, Rome governed territories stretching from the misty frontiers of Britannia to the sun-baked provinces of Syria and Judea. Millions of subjects lived under Roman rule, and the wealth of those lands flowed steadily into the city. Yet beneath the grandeur of marble temples, triumphal arches, and imperial palaces lay a dangerously fragile urban reality. Rome was overcrowded, poorly planned, and highly vulnerable to disaster, particularly fire. The population of Rome in the mid-1st century CE likely exceeded 1 million people, making it the largest city in the ancient world. Most of these inhabitants were not senators or aristocrats, but ordinary citizens, freedmen, slaves, laborers, and immigrants. They lived packed tightly into multi-story apartment buildings known as insulae. Constructed largely from wood, with narrow staircases and minimal structural regulation, these buildings were cheap, unstable, and extremely flammable. Cooking fires burned constantly. Oil lamps illuminated rooms through the night, and open flames were a routine part of daily life. Fire was both a necessity and a constant threat. The streets of Rome made matters worse. Many were narrow, winding, and congested, especially in older districts such as the Suburra. These alleys allowed little room for fire brigades, which were themselves poorly organized and often ineffective. Although Emperor Augustus had earlier created a firefighting force called the Vigiles, their numbers and equipment were insufficient for a disaster on a massive scale. When fires broke out, they could spread rapidly from building to building, fed by wind, wooden beams, and tightly packed structures. At the top of this unstable city stood Emperor Nero, a young ruler whose reign inspired fascination, fear, and controversy even during his lifetime. Nero had become emperor in 54 CE at the age of 16, succeeding his adoptive father Claudius. In his early years, he was guided by advisors such as the philosopher Seneca and the Praetorian prefect Burrus, and his rule initially showed moderation. However, by the early 60s CE, Nero had grown increasingly autocratic, indulgent, and suspicious of opposition. He was deeply invested in artistic pursuits, music, poetry, and performance, and often prioritized personal glory over administrative responsibility. Rome in 64 CE was therefore a city of extremes. Immense wealth beside crushing poverty, imperial authority alongside social unrest, architectural splendor resting on a foundation of wood, oil, and neglect. It was a city ripe for catastrophe, even if no one could yet imagine the scale of what was about to occur. When the fire came, it would not merely destroy buildings. It would expose political tensions, reshape imperial policy, and permanently alter the relationship between the Roman state and a small, misunderstood religious community, the Christians. Nero Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus remains one of the most infamous figures in Roman history. But understanding his role in the Great Fire requires separating legend from historical context. Born Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus in 37 CE, Nero was the son of Agrippina the Younger, a woman of formidable ambition and political skill. Through calculated marriages and alliances, Agrippina secured Nero's adoption by Emperor Claudius, positioning her son as heir to the imperial throne. When Claudius died in 54 CE, under circumstances later rumored to involve poison, Nero became emperor while still a teenager. In the early phase of his reign, Nero showed promise. He reduced taxes, banned secret trials, and promoted cultural life. Roman writers such as Tacitus suggest that during this period, effective governance was largely handled by Seneca and Burrus, who restrained Nero's excesses. However, as Nero matured, he increasingly rejected advice and pursued absolute authority. He ordered the execution of his stepbrother Britannicus, whom he viewed as a rival, and later arranged the murder of his own mother, Agrippina, when her influence became inconvenient. These acts profoundly damaged his moral authority and fueled elite resentment. What most distinguished Nero from previous emperors was his obsession with performance. He fancied himself a gifted singer, lyre player, poet, and actor, roles traditionally considered inappropriate for Roman nobility, let alone an emperor. Nero performed publicly, competed in Greek-style games, and demanded admiration from audiences that had little choice but to applaud. While some Romans admired his cultural enthusiasm, many elites saw his behavior as humiliating to the dignity of the empire. This divide between Nero's self-image and the expectations of Roman leadership would play a crucial role in how later generations interpreted his actions during the fire. By 64 CE, Nero was residing at his palace complex, including the Palatine Hill, though sources disagree on his exact location when the fire began. Ancient historians such as Tacitus, Suetonius, and Cassius Dio, writing decades later, present varying accounts, each shaped by political bias and post-Neronian hostility. Some claim Nero was absent from Rome when the fire broke out and returned quickly to organize relief efforts. Others accuse him of indifference, spectacle, or even direct responsibility. The famous phrase, "fiddled while Rome burned," is itself an anachronism. The fiddle did not exist in ancient Rome, and the instrument associated with Nero was the lyre. Still, the image endures because it captures a deeper accusation, that Nero was more concerned with art and self-glorification than with the suffering of his people. Whether or not he played music during the fire, Nero's reputation ensured that suspicion would cling to him. Understanding Nero as a complex figure, capable of administrative action, yet deeply narcissistic, is essential. He was neither a purely insane tyrant nor a misunderstood artist king. He was a ruler operating within an unstable political system, increasingly isolated from traditional elites and desperate to assert control. When the Great Fire erupted, it would become the defining event of his reign. crystallizing fears, rumors, and hostilities into a lasting historical judgment. On the night of July 18th, 64 CE, disaster struck with terrifying speed. According to the Roman historian Tacitus, the fire began in the commercial district near the Circus Maximus, a massive chariot racing stadium located between the Palatine and Aventine Hills. This area was crowded with shops filled with flammable goods such as oil, cloth, wood, and grain. A strong wind fanned the initial flames, transforming a localized blaze into an uncontrollable inferno within hours. As the fire spread, panic gripped the city. Residents awoke to walls of flame advancing through narrow streets, trapping families inside collapsing buildings. Many attempted to flee, only to find escape routes blocked by fire or debris. Others tried to save possessions, delaying their flight until it was too late. The lack of coordinated emergency response worsened the chaos. While the vigiles attempted to intervene, they were overwhelmed by the scale of the disaster. In some accounts, individuals were seen preventing firefighting efforts, either through confusion, malice, or alleged orders from unknown authorities, fueling later conspiracy theories. For 6 days and 7 nights, the fire raged across Rome. It destroyed or severely damaged 10 of the city's 14 administrative districts. Ancient temples, ancestral homes, public monuments, and countless insulae were reduced to ash. Only 4 districts remained largely untouched. Even after the main blaze was extinguished, renewed fires broke out, prolonging the devastation and deepening suspicion that the catastrophe was not entirely accidental. Rumors quickly spread among the population. Some whispered that the emperor himself had ordered the fire, either to clear space for an ambitious rebuilding project or to indulge a theatrical fantasy of watching a city burn like Troy. These rumors were fueled by Nero's known fascination with epic themes and dramatic performance. Although concrete evidence was lacking, the emotional power of the accusation proved difficult to suppress. In response, Nero took visible action. He opened the campus Martius and his own gardens to the homeless, organized food distribution, and imposed price controls to prevent profiteering. He also initiated plans for rebuilding Rome with wider streets, stricter building codes, and greater use of fire-resistant materials like stone and brick. These measures suggest a ruler attempting to manage a crisis, yet they failed to erase public doubt. The fire had done more than devastate Rome physically. It had shattered trust between ruler and people. Nero, facing widespread suspicion and political vulnerability, needed someone to blame. The search for scapegoats would soon turn toward a small, unpopular religious group already viewed with mistrust: the Christians. Their fate, and Rome's response to them, would mark a turning point in imperial religious policy and leave a legacy that echoes through history. In the aftermath of the Great Fire of Rome, the city was not only physically devastated, but psychologically shattered. Tens of thousands were homeless, entire neighborhoods lay in ruins, and Rome's ancient religious and cultural landmarks had vanished in smoke. In such an atmosphere, fear naturally transformed into suspicion, and suspicion quickly turned toward the most powerful man in the empire, Emperor Nero. Even as relief efforts began, rumors spread with alarming speed, suggesting that the catastrophe was not a tragic accident, but a deliberate act ordered, or at least welcomed, by the emperor himself. These rumors did not emerge in a vacuum. Nero already suffered from a damaged reputation among Rome's elite and common population alike. His artistic obsessions, public performances, and extravagant spending were widely criticized, particularly by senators who viewed his behavior as a rejection of traditional Roman values. Moreover, Nero had already demonstrated a willingness to eliminate perceived threats, even within his own family. Against this background, the idea that he might destroy part of Rome for personal or political reasons did not seem entirely implausible to many contemporaries. One of the most persistent accusations was that Nero wanted to clear large areas of the city to make space for a grand architectural project. Indeed, after the fire, Nero began construction of the Domus Aurea, or Golden House, an enormous palace complex that stretched across previously populated districts. This palace included artificial lakes, vast gardens, lavish halls covered in gold leaf, and elaborate decorative art. To critics, it appeared that Nero had profited directly from the destruction, reinforcing the belief that the fire had served his ambitions. Ancient historians present conflicting accounts. Tacitus, generally considered the most reliable source, admits that rumors accused Nero of singing about the fall of Troy while Rome burned, though he himself expresses uncertainty about the truth of this claim. Suetonius and Cassius Dio, writing later and with greater hostility toward Nero, present more dramatic and damning portrayals. However, it is important to recognize that all surviving literary sources were written after Nero's death, during a period when condemning him served political purposes for his successors. Despite the lack of concrete evidence, public belief does not require proof to be powerful. For many Romans, Nero's visible presence in the rebuilding process, rather than reassuring them, intensified suspicion. The emperor was seen reorganizing the city, imposing new building regulations, and redesigning Rome in ways that aligned with his vision. While these reforms had practical benefits, wider streets, fire-resistant materials, they also symbolized imperial control imposed upon a traumatized population. In the end, whether Nero ordered the fire is less important than the fact that many Romans believed he might have. This belief placed the emperor in a dangerous position. In Roman political culture, legitimacy depended not only on authority, but on perception. Nero needed to distance himself from the disaster, redirect public anger, and restore confidence in his rule. The solution he chose would have devastating consequences for an already vulnerable group within Roman society. Scapegoating was not an unusual response to catastrophe in the ancient world. Romans, like many ancient societies, interpreted disasters not merely as random events, but as signs of divine displeasure or human wrongdoing. Fires, plagues, and earthquakes were often seen as punishments inflicted by the gods, and restoring balance required identifying and punishing those responsible. After the Great Fire, this cultural framework made the search for culprits almost inevitable. Roman religion was deeply intertwined with the state. Traditional worship involved public rituals, sacrifices, and festivals meant to maintain the Pax Deorum, the peace between Rome and its gods. Any group perceived as rejecting these practices could be viewed as endangering society as a whole. This mindset created fertile ground for blaming minorities, foreigners, or religious outsiders during times of crisis. Nero, facing mounting suspicion himself, had both political and cultural incentives to exploit this tendency. The homeless population, crowded into temporary shelters and dependent on imperial aid, grew restless and angry. Food shortages, disease, and uncertainty intensified resentment. While Nero's relief measures demonstrated administrative action, they could not address the deeper emotional need for justice and explanation. The idea that the fire was accidental offered little comfort to those who had lost everything. A deliberate enemy, however, provided a target for collective anger and a sense that order could be restored through punishment. At the same time, Nero's relationship with the Roman elite had deteriorated significantly. Senators distrusted him, and rumors of conspiracy were common. Accusing influential political rivals would have been dangerous, potentially provoking rebellion. Nero therefore needed a group that lacked political power, public sympathy, and the ability to resist. The chosen scapegoats had to be socially isolated, widely disliked, and already viewed as suspicious. Within this context, the Christians were an ideal target. They were few in number, but highly visible due to their distinct practices. They refused to participate in traditional religious rituals, declined to honor the emperor as divine, and met in private gatherings that fueled rumors of secret crimes. To many Romans, Christianity appeared not merely strange, but subversive, undermining the religious foundations of the state. By redirecting blame toward the Christians, Nero could achieve several objectives at once. He could deflect accusations against himself, demonstrate decisive leadership, and present himself as the defender of Roman tradition against dangerous outsiders. The persecution that followed was therefore not a random outburst of cruelty, but a calculated political act shaped by cultural assumptions and imperial necessity. The consequences, however, would far exceed Nero's immediate goals and leave a lasting mark on Roman and Christian history alike. Before the Great Fire, the Christian community in Rome was small, fragmented, and largely invisible to the centers of power. Christianity had arrived in the city gradually, likely through Jewish diaspora networks and traveling missionaries rather than through direct apostolic leadership. By the early 60s CE, Roman Christians consisted of both Jewish converts and Gentiles, forming loosely connected house churches scattered across the city's neighborhoods. They were not yet an organized institution, nor did they possess political influence or legal recognition. What distinguished Christians most sharply from their neighbors was not their numbers, but their beliefs and behavior. Christians worshipped one God exclusively and rejected the Roman pantheon entirely. They refused to offer sacrifices to the traditional gods or to the emperor, actions that Romans interpreted not as personal religious choices, but as acts of disloyalty. In Roman eyes, honoring the gods was a civic duty, essential to the stability of the empire. Refusal to do so marked Christians as dangerous outsiders. Additionally, Christian practices were widely misunderstood. Their private gatherings, known as agape meals, were rumored to involve immoral behavior. Their symbolic language, speaking of eating the body and drinking the blood of Christ, was misinterpreted as cannibalism. Their emphasis on loyalty to Christ above family and state fueled accusations that they rejected Roman social values. While these claims were false, they circulated freely in a society with little direct knowledge of Christian doctrine. Importantly, Christians had already begun to attract hostility before the fire. They were occasionally targeted by local mobs and subject to informal harassment, though no empire-wide persecution existed at this stage. Roman authorities generally ignored Christians unless they caused public disorder. However, their refusal to participate in public religious life made them conspicuous during moments of crisis, when divine anger was believed to threaten the entire community. When Nero sought a group to blame for the fire, Christians fit the role perfectly. They were religiously deviant, socially isolated, and lacked defenders among the elite. By labeling them enemies of Rome, Nero could transform vague suspicion into a clear narrative. The fire was the result of a hated sect that rejected the gods and brought disaster upon the city. This narrative, though false, was persuasive to a traumatized population desperate for answers. Thus, the Christians' marginal status became their greatest vulnerability. What followed would not only mark the first major imperial persecution of Christianity, but also redefine the relationship between faith, power, and suffering in the Roman world. Once suspicion against Nero reached a dangerous intensity, The emperor was forced to act decisively. In Roman political culture, silence in the face of accusation could be interpreted as guilt. Nero therefore moved to redirect public anger by transforming rumor into an official narrative, one sanctioned by imperial authority. According to Tacitus, Nero publicly announced that the Christians were responsible for the Great Fire of Rome, accusing them of committing arson out of hatred for humanity and contempt for Roman gods. This accusation marked a critical turning point, not only in Nero's reign, but in the history of Christianity itself. The decision to blame the Christians was calculated. Nero did not present evidence in a modern legal sense. Instead, he relied on existing prejudice and fear. The charge of odium homini generis, or hatred of the human race, was especially effective. It framed Christians not merely as religious dissenters, but as enemies of social order. By defining them as a threat to humanity itself, Nero justified extraordinary punishment while appearing to act in defense of Rome. Roman law at the time did not explicitly outlaw Christianity. However, Roman justice was flexible and heavily influenced by imperial will. The emperor possessed broad authority to punish behaviors deemed harmful to public order or religious stability. By associating Christianity with treason, impiety, and mass murder, Nero transformed a marginal religious movement into a criminal conspiracy in the public imagination. This legal ambiguity allowed persecution to proceed without formal trials or consistent procedures. Arrests followed swiftly. Christians were identified through informants, denunciations, and forced confessions. Under torture, some were compelled to name others, creating a chain of accusations that expanded the scope of repression. Tacitus notes that while many Romans believed Christians were guilty, sympathy emerged as punishments escalated beyond what seemed proportionate, revealing the cruelty underlying the imperial response. Importantly, Nero's accusation served multiple purposes. It diverted attention from himself, satisfied public demands for justice, and reinforced the authority of the emperor as protector of Roman tradition. At the same time, it sent a clear message to other potential dissidents. Deviation from accepted religious norms would not be tolerated when it threatened imperial stability. This moment represents the first known instance in which the Roman state explicitly targeted Christians as a group. While earlier hostility had been local and sporadic, Nero's actions established a precedent for imperial involvement. Christianity was no longer merely strange or unpopular. It had been declared dangerous. The consequences of this designation would reverberate through the next 3 centuries of Roman history. The persecution of Christians under Nero was not limited to imprisonment or quiet execution. Instead, it became a public spectacle designed to instill fear, reinforce imperial authority, and satisfy a traumatized population's desire for vengeance. Tacitus provides chilling descriptions of the punishments inflicted upon the accused, emphasizing not only their brutality, but their theatrical nature. These were not merely acts of justice. They were performances staged for public consumption. Christians were subjected to executions intended to shock and horrify. Some were sewn into the skins of wild animals and torn apart by dogs in public arenas. Others were crucified, a punishment reserved for slaves and the lowest criminals, meant to humiliate as well as kill. Still others were coated in flammable materials and set alight at night to serve as living torches in Nero's gardens. These macabre illuminations, burning human bodies used as lamps, symbolized the complete dehumanization of the victims. Nero himself reportedly attended these events, sometimes dressed as a charioteer, blurring the line between ruler and performer. Whether every detail of these accounts is accurate remains debated among historians, but the consistency of multiple sources suggests that extreme cruelty was indeed employed. The use of public gardens and entertainment spaces transformed persecution into propaganda, reinforcing the message that enemies of Rome would be destroyed without mercy. Yet the strategy carried risks. As Tacitus notes, public opinion began to shift. While Christians were disliked, many Romans were disturbed by the excessiveness of the punishments. Sympathy arose not because the victims were believed innocent, but because they appear to be suffering not for the public good, but to satisfy the emperor's cruelty. This subtle change in perception undermined Nero's goal of restoring trust and instead reinforced his image as a tyrant. The politics of fear, while effective in the short term, eroded the moral legitimacy of imperial power. By using extreme violence to control narrative, Nero exposed the fragility of his authority. The persecution failed to erase suspicion against him, and instead contributed to the growing sense that his rule was arbitrary and dangerous. For the Christian community, these executions had an unintended effect. Rather than eliminating the movement, the public suffering of believers strengthened internal solidarity and commitment. Martyrdom became a powerful symbol of faith, transforming victims into witnesses whose deaths testified to the truth of their beliefs. What Nero intended as annihilation would instead become a foundational story of endurance and identity. Beyond physical violence, Nero's persecution of Christians inflicted deep psychological trauma. The sudden transformation of daily life into a landscape of fear forced believers into impossible choices. Many went into hiding, abandoning homes, families, and occupations to avoid arrest. Christian gatherings, once modest expressions of communal worship, became clandestine meetings held in secrecy. Trust eroded as the threat of informants and forced confessions meant that any association could be dangerous. The broader Roman population was also affected. Public executions normalized extreme cruelty and reinforced the idea that the state could suspend moral limits in times of crisis. Fear became a tool of governance. Silence replaced debate, and conformity was reinforced through terror. This atmosphere discouraged sympathy and resistance, ensuring short-term stability at the cost of long-term moral decay. Within the Christian community, persecution reshaped theology and identity. The concept of martyrdom, derived from the Greek word marties, meaning witness, gained profound significance. Those who died for their faith were believed to imitate Christ's suffering and to receive divine reward. Stories of executions circulated orally, preserving names and details, transforming loss into meaning. Suffering was no longer a sign of divine abandonment, but evidence of spiritual truth. This reinterpretation of persecution proved transformative. Fear did not disappear, but it was reframed. Death became a testimony rather than an end. This mindset allowed Christianity to survive and eventually spread, even under hostile conditions. Ironically, Nero's attempt to eradicate the movement provided it with a powerful narrative that attracted future converts impressed by its resilience. For Nero himself, the psychological consequences were disastrous. The persecution failed to restore his reputation. Within 4 years, revolts erupted across the empire. In 68 CE, abandoned by the Senate and the Praetorian Guard, Nero fled Rome and ultimately took his own life. His death marked the end of the Julio-Claudian dynasty and plunged the empire into civil war. Thus, the Great Fire and its aftermath did not simply destroy a city. They reshaped political authority, religious identity, and the moral landscape of Rome. The flames that consumed Rome also forged a legacy of suffering and resistance that would outlast Nero, his palace, and even the empire he ruled. After the flames finally died down, Rome stood transformed into a vast field of ruins. Entire districts had vanished, leaving behind scorched earth, collapsed foundations, and displaced populations struggling to survive. In this moment of devastation, Emperor Nero initiated one of the most ambitious urban reconstruction efforts in ancient history. Officially, this rebuilding was presented as a practical necessity and a benevolent act of leadership. In reality, it also served as a powerful political tool, allowing Nero to reshape both the physical city and the narrative surrounding his rule. Nero issued new building regulations that fundamentally altered Rome's urban landscape. Streets were widened to act as fire breaks, reducing the likelihood of future disasters. Height restrictions were imposed on residential buildings, and the use of fire-resistant materials, such as brick and stone, was encouraged, if not required. Porticos were added to provide shelter and create orderly public spaces. On the surface, these reforms reflected genuine concern for public safety and urban efficiency, and in many respects, they were sensible and forward-looking. However, Reconstruction also centralized imperial authority. Property boundaries were redrawn, land was redistributed, and the emperor exerted direct control over planning decisions that had once been local or private. Many displaced residents were forced to accept compensation rather than reclaim their original homes, severing long-standing connections to neighborhoods and ancestral land. This process alienated segments of the population who felt excluded from the new Rome being built around them. Moreover, rebuilding created opportunities for imperial display. New monuments, avenues, and public works emphasized order, symmetry, and grandeur, projecting an image of stability restored through Nero's leadership. Coins were minted portraying the emperor as a benefactor and restorer of the city. Official rhetoric framed the fire not as a failure of imperial governance, but as a tragic event from which Nero had heroically guided Rome toward renewal. Yet skepticism remained widespread. The speed and scale of reconstruction, combined with Nero's increasing personal involvement, reinforced suspicions that the fire had conveniently cleared space for his ambitions. While the city physically rose from the ashes, trust did not recover as easily. For many Romans, the new Rome felt imposed rather than shared, a reminder that imperial power could reshape lives as easily as buildings. Thus, Reconstruction became a double-edged sword. It demonstrated administrative capability and long-term vision, but it also exposed the authoritarian nature of Nero's rule. The rebuilt city stood as both an achievement and an accusation, silently raising the question that would haunt Nero until his death. Was Rome rebuilt for its people or for its emperor? At the center of post-fire controversy stood Nero's most infamous architectural project, the Domus Aurea, or Golden House. This sprawling palace complex was unlike anything Rome had ever seen. Extending across large sections of the Palatine, Esquiline, and Celian hills, the Domus Aurea incorporated gardens, vineyards, artificial lakes, banquet halls, and vast residential spaces decorated with gold leaf, precious stones, and elaborate frescoes. It was not merely a palace, but an immersive imperial landscape designed to glorify the emperor. To Nero, the Domus Aurea represented artistic triumph and personal expression. He envisioned architecture as a form of performance, with the emperor as both creator and central figure. Rotating dining rooms, innovative lighting effects, and carefully choreographed vistas reflected Nero's desire to live within a work of art. Ancient writers record that Nero famously remarked that he was at last beginning to live like a human being, revealing how deeply the palace symbolized his self-image. For the Roman population, however, the Domus Aurea became a symbol of excess and injustice. While thousands remained homeless or struggled to rebuild modest dwellings, vast tracts of prime urban land were reserved for imperial pleasure. The contrast between public suffering and private luxury fueled resentment. Even those who appreciated Nero's artistic sensibilities could not ignore the political message embedded in the palace. The emperor stood above the city, both literally and figuratively. The Domus Aurea also reinforced suspicions about the fire's origins. Though direct evidence was lacking, many Romans believed that such an immense project could only have been planned before the fire, not conceived afterward. The palace's scale suggested premeditation, and its placement across formerly populated areas deepened mistrust. Whether fair or not, the association between destruction and imperial gain proved impossible to erase. After Nero's death, the palace's fate reflected changing political priorities. His successors deliberately dismantled or repurposed much of the Domus Aurea, filling in its lake to build the Colosseum and covering its halls with new public structures. This deliberate erasure was symbolic. Later emperors sought to distance themselves from Nero's legacy by reclaiming space for the people. Ironically, the buried remains of the Domus Aurea preserved its artistic innovations, influencing Renaissance artists centuries later. Yet in its own time, the Golden House stood as a powerful reminder of how architecture could embody political ambition, personal ego, and public resentment all at once. In the years following the Great Fire, Nero faced a challenge greater than reconstruction, controlling how the disaster would be remembered. In Roman society, memory was a political battlefield. Monuments, festivals, inscriptions, and public rituals shaped collective understanding of the past. Nero attempted to use these tools to redefine the fire as a moment of renewal rather than suspicion, positioning himself as the architect of Rome's rebirth. Imperial propaganda emphasized generosity and order. Relief efforts were publicized, rebuilding projects celebrated, and blame firmly assigned to the Christians. Official silence surrounded lingering questions about responsibility, while artistic and architectural grandeur projected confidence. Yet memory could not be fully controlled. Oral accounts, private conversations, and elite histories preserved alternative narratives that cast Nero as a tyrant who benefited from destruction. Roman historians played a critical role in shaping Nero's posthumous image. Tacitus, Suetonius, and Cassius Dio wrote under later regimes that had strong incentives to condemn Nero and legitimize their own rule by contrast. Their works emphasized cruelty, extravagance, and moral decay, ensuring that Nero's name would become synonymous with excess and misrule. While modern historians approach these sources with caution, their influence on collective memory is undeniable. For Christians, memory took a different form. The persecution under Nero became a foundational story, passed down through generations as evidence of faith tested by fire. Martyrs were remembered not as victims of imperial politics, but as witnesses to divine truth. This parallel memory tradition preserved a counter-narrative in which Roman power appeared transient and morally hollow. Over time, these competing memories converged into a dominant image of Nero as a villainous ruler whose reign marked a moral low point. The Great Fire became inseparable from his legacy, regardless of historical uncertainty. Architecture, persecution, and rumor fused into a single story of imperial arrogance punished by history. Thus, The aftermath of the fire demonstrates that power over cities does not guarantee power over memory. Nero rebuilt Rome in stone and marble, but the story of the fire was rebuilt in words, beliefs, and traditions beyond his control. That story would outlast his reign, shaping how Rome, Christianity, and tyranny itself would be understood for centuries to come. Although Nero survived the immediate crisis of the Great Fire, the disaster fundamentally weakened his authority in ways that could not be repaired by architecture or propaganda. Before 64 CE, Nero's rule, while controversial, had not yet collapsed into open instability. After the fire, however, cracks in the political structure of his reign widened rapidly. The emperor's legitimacy, already fragile due to personal excess and elite hostility, was further eroded by the widespread belief that he had either caused or exploited the catastrophe. Roman emperors relied on a delicate balance of support from three key groups: the Senate, the military, and the urban population. The fire damaged Nero's relationship with all three. Senators resented the loss of ancestral properties and suspected Nero of using the disaster to eliminate elite neighborhoods. Many were also alarmed by the precedent of blaming an entire religious group for a civic disaster, seeing it as a sign that imperial power had become arbitrary and dangerous. Fear replaced loyalty, and silence replaced cooperation. Among the urban population, gratitude for relief efforts coexisted with resentment over displacement and reconstruction policies. While Nero provided temporary housing and food, many Romans felt excluded from decisions about rebuilding. Compensation was often inadequate, and the new city regulations favored wealthy landowners and imperial projects. The sense that Rome was being rebuilt for Nero rather than for its people fueled quiet anger and distrust. The military, particularly the Praetorian Guard, also became uneasy. Nero's increasing dependence on spectacle, performance, and personal indulgence contrasted sharply with the traditional image of a disciplined Roman leader. While the Guard remained loyal for the moment, confidence in Nero's long-term stability diminished. In Roman political culture, perception of weakness was dangerous. It invited conspiracy. The fire also intensified Nero's isolation. He increasingly withdrew from traditional governing structures, relying on a shrinking circle of loyalists and informants. This isolation amplified paranoia, leading to harsher punishments and more frequent executions of perceived enemies. Each act of repression further alienated elites and reinforced the impression of a ruler ruling through fear rather than consent. Thus, while Rome physically recovered, Nero's political position did not. The fire acted as a catalyst, accelerating existing tensions and transforming discontent into latent rebellion. Authority, once questioned, could not be easily restored. The emperor still wore the crown, but the foundation beneath it had begun to crumble. As Nero's confidence declined, fear became the dominant feature of his rule. The years following the Great Fire were marked by increasing paranoia, as the emperor became convinced that enemies surrounded him. In 65 CE, just 1 year after the fire, these fears appeared justified when the Pisonian conspiracy was uncovered, a wide-ranging plot involving senators, equestrians, officers, and intellectuals who sought to assassinate Nero and replace him with Gaius Calpurnius Piso. The discovery of the conspiracy confirmed Nero's worst suspicions and triggered a wave of brutal repression. Real and imagined enemies were arrested, interrogated, and executed. Torture became routine, and denunciations spread rapidly as individuals sought to protect themselves by accusing others. The atmosphere of fear deepened, and trust within Rome's elite collapsed entirely. Among the victims was the philosopher Seneca, Nero's former tutor and advisor. Although evidence of his involvement in the conspiracy was weak, Seneca was ordered to commit suicide. His death symbolized the complete breakdown of the early promise of Nero's reign. Burrus, another stabilizing figure, had already died under suspicious circumstances. With their removal, no moderating influence remained. This cycle of conspiracy and repression weakened the state rather than strengthening it. Skilled administrators were eliminated, loyalty was replaced by terror, and the emperor's judgment grew increasingly erratic. Rather than restoring confidence after the fire, Nero's actions convinced many that the empire was being governed by fear and impulse rather than reason. The persecution of Christians must be understood within this broader context. It was not an isolated act, but part of a larger pattern of using violence to control narrative and suppress dissent. The fire had taught Nero that fear could redirect public anger, but it had also shown the limits of terror as a governing strategy. By the mid-60s CE, Rome was no longer merely recovering from disaster. It was drifting toward political collapse. The fire had exposed Nero's vulnerabilities, and his response to that exposure accelerated his isolation. The empire remained vast and powerful, but its ruler had become a liability. While Nero struggled to maintain control in Rome, events in the provinces revealed how deeply imperial authority had been compromised. The Great Fire and its aftermath were not confined to the capital. They were observed, discussed, and interpreted across the empire. Provincial governors, military commanders, and local elites paid close attention to the instability at the center of power, drawing conclusions that would soon have dramatic consequences. In Roman political culture, the emperor's ability to maintain order in Rome itself was seen as a measure of divine favor and political legitimacy. The chaos following the fire, combined with persecution, conspiracies, and extravagant construction, suggested weakness rather than strength. Provincial leaders began to question whether Nero could still command loyalty in a crisis. Economic pressures added to this erosion of support. Rebuilding Rome required enormous resources, leading to increased taxation and financial extraction from the provinces. This burden was deeply unpopular, particularly in regions already strained by military costs. Resentment grew as provincial populations were asked to fund an imperial capital that appeared increasingly disconnected from their realities. In the military, loyalty began to shift from the emperor to individual commanders. Generals stationed in Gaul, Hispania, and the eastern provinces commanded troops who were more loyal to their immediate leaders than to a distant and unpopular ruler. This decentralization of loyalty was extremely dangerous. Roman history repeatedly demonstrated that emperors fell not through assassination alone, but through military defection. By 67 CE, open rebellion was no longer unthinkable. The revolt of Gaius Julius Vindex in Gaul, followed by the declaration of Galba as emperor by Spanish legions, marked the beginning of the end. While these events occurred after the fire, the disaster and its aftermath created the conditions that made rebellion possible. Nero's loss of moral authority, political trust, and elite support transformed dissatisfaction into action. Thus, the Great Fire of Rome was not merely an urban catastrophe. It was a turning point that exposed the fragility of imperial power. The flames that consumed the city also illuminated the weaknesses of Nero's rule, signaling to the empire that the center could no longer hold. By the late 60s CE, the authority of Emperor Nero had eroded beyond repair. What had begun as quiet resentment after the Great Fire of Rome gradually transformed into open defiance. The fire had acted as a catalyst, exposing weaknesses in Nero's leadership and accelerating the breakdown of loyalty across the empire. By 68 C, rebellion was no longer a distant threat. It had become an undeniable reality. The first major challenge came from the provinces. Gaius Julius Vindex, governor of Gallia Lugdunensis, openly revolted against Nero, accusing him of tyranny and misrule. Although Vindex's rebellion was militarily unsuccessful, its symbolic significance was enormous. For the first time, a Roman governor publicly challenged the legitimacy of the emperor. More importantly, Vindex called upon other provincial leaders to support a new candidate for imperial power, signaling that Nero was no longer seen as inevitable. That candidate was Servius Sulpicius Galba, governor of Hispania Tarraconensis. Galba was an experienced administrator with strong senatorial backing. When his legions declared him emperor, the balance of power shifted decisively. What made this moment critical was not merely Galba's claim, but the response it triggered. One by one, key military commanders refused to defend Nero. The emperor, who had once commanded the loyalty of Rome's armed forces, now found himself isolated. In Rome, panic spread. The Senate, long intimidated by Nero's cruelty, sensed an opportunity to act. Senators who had survived years of fear began quietly distancing themselves from the emperor. The Praetorian Guard, whose loyalty Nero depended upon for survival, grew increasingly unreliable. When Galba promised them financial rewards, their allegiance wavered. The memory of the Great Fire lingered in all these decisions. Nero's perceived responsibility for the disaster, his persecution of Christians, his extravagant rebuilding projects, and his inability to restore trust all contributed to the sense that his reign had become a liability to the empire. The fire had symbolized chaos, and Nero had come to embody it. Thus, rebellion was not a sudden collapse, but the final stage of a long decline. The empire did not fall apart overnight. It withdrew its support piece by piece. By the time Nero fully grasped the situation, the structures that sustained his power had already dissolved. As rebellion closed in, Nero's final days were marked by confusion, denial, and despair. Abandoned by allies and surrounded by enemies, the emperor who had once ruled the known world found himself increasingly alone. News arrived that the Senate had declared him a public enemy, authorizing his execution. The Praetorian Guard, once his protectors, refused to defend him. In a dramatic reversal of fortune, Nero became a fugitive within his own empire. He fled Rome in disguise, seeking refuge at the villa of a loyal freedman outside the city. Ancient sources describe his behavior during this period as erratic and emotionally unstable. He reportedly lamented the loss of his artistic legacy, reciting poetry and reflecting on how history might remember him. These accounts, though possibly exaggerated, reveal how deeply Nero identified himself not as a statesman, but as a performer whose life had been a tragic drama. As soldiers approached, Nero hesitated to end his own life. Roman culture viewed suicide as an acceptable, even honorable, alternative to public execution, particularly for elites. Yet Nero reportedly struggled to act, requiring assistance from a companion to complete the act. His final words, according to tradition, were qualis artifex perio, what an artist dies in me, whether authentic or not. The phrase captured how Nero wished to be remembered. Nero's death in June 68 CE marked the end of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, which had ruled Rome since Augustus. His body was buried quietly, without the grand ceremonies afforded to respected emperors. The empire he left behind was unstable, soon descending into the year of the four emperors, a violent civil war that confirmed how deeply Nero's reign had weakened imperial cohesion. In Roman memory, Nero's suicide was not seen as tragic, but as inevitable. The fire, the persecution, the paranoia, and the excesses all appeared to lead naturally toward this conclusion. His death did not bring immediate peace, but it did bring closure to a reign defined by spectacle and suspicion. After Nero's death, Roman society moved quickly to condemn him. Statues were torn down, inscriptions erased, and his name subjected to damnatio memoriae, the symbolic destruction of memory. While not all records of Nero were eliminated, official Rome sought to distance itself from his reign as decisively as possible. The Great Fire of Rome became central to this condemnation, serving as the defining event through which Nero's entire rule was judged. Historians writing under subsequent emperors shaped Nero's image as a monster of cruelty and excess. The fire was portrayed as either his crime or the ultimate proof of his moral failure. Even when uncertainty was acknowledged, suspicion dominated. Nero's persecution of Christians, once politically expedient, now appeared as evidence of sadism and injustice. For the Roman state, condemning Nero served an important purpose. It allowed later emperors to present themselves as restorers of order and morality. By framing Nero as uniquely corrupt, the system itself was protected from blame. The fire thus became a moral lesson rather than a structural failure, a story about one bad ruler rather than deeper problems in Roman governance. For Christians, Nero's legacy took on a different meaning. He became the archetypal persecutor, the first imperial enemy of the faith. In later Christian tradition, Nero was sometimes associated with the Antichrist, a symbol of ultimate evil and opposition to God. The fire and the persecution were remembered not as defeat, but as the beginning of a long struggle that ultimately validated Christian belief. Across centuries, Nero's name endured as a warning. The Great Fire ensured that he would never be remembered as a reformer or artist, but as a ruler whose ambitions burned alongside his city. In this way, the fire outlived Nero himself, shaping historical judgment long after the flames were extinguished. The death of Emperor Nero in 68 CE did not bring immediate stability to Rome. Instead, it plunged the empire into one of the most turbulent periods in its history, the Year of the Four Emperors. This civil war, marked by rapid changes in leadership and widespread violence, exposed the fragility of imperial power that the Great Fire had already revealed. The fire had undermined trust in Nero's rule. His death removed the last illusion of continuity. The first to claim power was Galba, whose rebellion had helped bring down Nero. Initially welcomed as a liberator, Galba quickly alienated key groups through harsh discipline and refusal to reward soldiers who had supported him. The Roman population, exhausted by years of fear, fire, and repression, found little comfort in his austere leadership. Within months, Galba was assassinated by members of the Praetorian Guard, demonstrating how deeply loyalty had eroded. Otho followed Galba, ruling only briefly before being challenged by Vitellius, whose legions marched from Germany. Battles erupted across Italy, bringing war directly into the heart of the empire. Cities were looted, civilians killed, and soldiers fought not for Rome, but for competing claimants to power. The memory of the Great Fire remained vivid, reinforcing the sense that Rome itself had become cursed by instability. Vitellius's reign was no more successful. His indulgence and mismanagement echoed the excesses of Nero, further alienating the population. Meanwhile, a new contender emerged from the eastern provinces, Vespasian, a seasoned general commanding loyal legions. When his forces advanced, Rome once again became a battlefield. The city that had barely recovered from fire now endured siege, street fighting, and destruction. This year of chaos demonstrated that Nero's fall had not solved Rome's problems. It had revealed them. The fire had weakened the symbolic authority of the emperor, civil war shattered what remained. Rome survived, but the myth of imperial invulnerability was gone forever. Long after the flames were extinguished, the great fire of Rome continued to haunt the collective memory of its people. Trauma lingered in physical scars across the city and psychological wounds carried by survivors. Entire neighborhoods had vanished, families displaced, and sacred spaces destroyed. Even as new buildings rose, memory refused to fade. Romans interpreted disaster through religion, politics, and storytelling. Many believed the fire had been a sign of divine anger, a punishment for moral decay and impiety. Others saw it as proof that emperors were not protected by the gods, undermining centuries-old assumptions about imperial destiny. These interpretations shaped how Romans understood not only Nero, but the nature of power itself. Public rituals attempted to restore confidence. Temples were rebuilt, festivals reinstated, and sacrifices offered to appease the gods. Yet beneath these efforts lay anxiety. Fires continued to break out in later years, each one reviving fear that catastrophe could return at any moment. The Great Fire became a reference point, a benchmark against which all future disasters were measured. Historians, poets, and orators kept the memory alive. Accounts of the fire were retold in dramatic language, emphasizing chaos, suffering, and moral lessons. Nero's alleged actions during the fire became symbolic of failed leadership, regardless of historical certainty. Over time, memory hardened into narrative and narrative into judgment. The fire also reshaped urban identity. Rebuilt Rome was more orderly and monumental, but it lacked the intimate familiarity of the old neighborhoods. For many, the new city felt imposed, a reminder that personal histories had been erased. Trauma thus became embedded not only in stories, but in stone. For the Christian community, the period after Nero's death was both dangerous and formative. The persecution associated with the Great Fire had inflicted devastating losses, yet it had also strengthened communal identity. Christians who survived carried memories of martyrdom that would define their faith for generations. Importantly, Nero's persecution did not establish a permanent policy of empire-wide repression. Later emperors did not consistently target Christians, but the precedent had been set. Christianity was now known to the Roman state as a distinct group capable of attracting suspicion. This ambiguous status, neither legal nor fully outlawed, created uncertainty that would persist for centuries. Martyr stories circulated widely, emphasizing courage, endurance, and faith under fire. These narratives transformed suffering into meaning and reinforced the belief that persecution was not failure, but fulfillment. The memory of Nero became central to this worldview, representing the ultimate example of worldly power opposed to divine truth. At the same time, Christianity continued to grow. The fire and persecution paradoxically drew attention to the movement, attracting converts impressed by its resilience. Urban networks expanded, and Christian communities became more organized. Leadership structures strengthened, preparing the church to endure future challenges. Thus, the Great Fire shaped Christian identity as profoundly as it shaped Roman politics. It marked the moment when Christianity emerged from obscurity into history, defined by suffering and survival. Nero sought to erase the movement. Instead, he ensured it would be remembered. Out of the violence and uncertainty of the year of the four emperors emerged a leader whose greatest strength was not charisma or spectacle, but stability. Vespasian, a seasoned general from a relatively modest background, was proclaimed emperor in 69 CE. His rise marked a decisive shift in Roman political culture, one deeply shaped by the memory of Nero and the Great Fire. Where Nero had embodied excess and unpredictability, Vespasian presented himself as practical, disciplined, and rooted in traditional Roman values. Vespasian's legitimacy rested primarily on military support. His command in Judea during the Jewish revolt had earned him the loyalty of Eastern legions, and his victory over Vitellius' forces secured control of Rome. Yet military success alone was not enough. The empire, traumatized by fire, persecution, and civil war, needed reassurance that order could be restored and maintained. From the beginning, Vespasian emphasized fiscal responsibility and administrative reform. He inherited an empty treasury, drained by Nero's extravagance and the costs of civil war. Through pragmatic taxation and careful management, Vespasian rebuilt state finances. Though some measures were unpopular, they were widely seen as necessary. In contrast to Nero's artistic ambitions, Vespasian's priorities reflected a return to sober governance. Symbolism mattered deeply in this transition. Vespasian consciously distanced himself from Nero's legacy. He rejected excessive luxury and cultivated an image of simplicity. This contrast was not accidental. It was a deliberate response to the disasters associated with Nero's reign. The Great Fire had taught Rome that spectacle without responsibility was dangerous. Vespasian's rule offered a corrective. Thus, the rise of Vespasian was not merely a change in leadership, but a shift in imperial identity. His reign demonstrated how profoundly the fire and its aftermath had reshaped Roman expectations of power. The empire sought not brilliance, but reliability. One of the most powerful responses to Nero's legacy came not through words, but through architecture. On land once occupied by Nero's Domus Aurea, Vespasian ordered the construction of what would become the Colosseum, the largest amphitheater in the Roman world. This decision was deeply symbolic. Where Nero had built private luxury, Vespasian built public space. The Colosseum represented a reversal of imperial priorities. Its construction signaled that land seized during Nero's reign was being returned to the people. The artificial lake of the Domus Aurea was drained, and its extravagant halls were buried beneath new foundations. In their place rose an arena designed for mass entertainment, capable of holding tens of thousands of spectators. This architectural transformation addressed lingering resentment from the Great Fire. Many Romans had believed Nero used the disaster to expand his palace. By dismantling that palace and replacing it with a public monument, Vespasian reframed memory. The city's wounds were not erased, but they were reinterpreted. The Colosseum became a symbol of renewal and shared identity. Yet this renewal was complex. The games held within the Colosseum, gladiatorial combat, executions, and animal hunts, were themselves acts of controlled violence. They reminded Romans that order was maintained through power. Unlike Nero's cruelty, however, this violence was institutionalized and ritualized, reinforcing state authority rather than personal whim. In this way, architecture became historical argument. Stone and spectacle asserted that the era of arbitrary excess had ended. Rome would remember Nero through ruins buried underground, while new monuments proclaimed a restored moral order. The Great Fire had reshaped the city. The Colosseum reshaped its meaning. The Great Fire of Rome left a permanent imprint on imperial governance. Later emperors, beginning with Vespasian, ruled with an awareness that disasters could destroy legitimacy as effectively as rebellion. Fire prevention, urban planning, and public order became matters of state security rather than local concern. New building regulations introduced after 64 CE were maintained and expanded. Fire-resistant materials became standard, and the vigiles were strengthened. These measures reflected lessons painfully learned, that neglect of infrastructure could undermine imperial authority. The memory of the fire acted as a warning, shaping policy long after Nero's death. Politically, the fire demonstrated the dangers of scapegoating. While blaming Christians had temporarily diverted anger, it ultimately failed to restore trust. Later emperors were more cautious in their approach to religious minorities, preferring ambiguity and local discretion over dramatic persecution. The shadow of Nero's excess made overt cruelty politically risky. The fire also altered how emperors presented themselves. Public visibility was now balanced with restraint. Rulers emphasized service, justice, and continuity rather than personal brilliance. The image of the emperor as performer, so central to Nero's identity, became a negative example cited implicitly, if not explicitly. In Roman collective memory, the Great Fire became a dividing line. Before it lay the illusion of imperial invulnerability. After it, a recognition of fragility. The city rebuilt itself, stronger and more ordered, but never again with the same confidence. The fire had burned away certainty, leaving behind caution. Thus, the legacy of the Great Fire extended far beyond 64 CE. It reshaped architecture, governance, religion, and political culture. Even as new emperors restored order, they ruled in a world forever changed by the night Rome burned. Although Nero's persecution of Christians was brutal, it was also limited in time and scope. It did not establish Christianity as permanently illegal throughout the empire, nor did it produce a formal imperial law banning the faith. However, its true significance lay elsewhere. It created a precedent. For the first time, the Roman state had identified Christians as a distinct group that could be blamed for public disaster and punished collectively. This single act would shape Roman-Christian relations for generations. Before 64 CE, Christianity had largely existed below the radar of imperial authority. Roman officials tended to see Christians as a minor Jewish sect, socially odd, but politically insignificant. Nero's accusation changed that perception. Christianity became visible not as a theological curiosity, but as a potential threat to public order. From this point forward, Roman governors and emperors knew that Christians could be singled out when stability appeared endangered. Importantly, Nero's persecution framed Christians not as criminals for specific acts, but as criminals for who they were. This distinction mattered deeply. Roman law traditionally punished actions, not beliefs. By associating Christian identity itself with arson, impiety, and hatred of humanity, Nero blurred that line. Later officials would struggle with this ambiguity, unsure whether Christians should be punished for illegal behavior or for refusal to conform. The memory of Nero also served as a warning. His cruelty and excess became examples of what emperors should avoid. As a result, later rulers were cautious. They did not rush to repeat his persecution on a grand scale. Yet they did not erase it either. Instead, Nero's actions lingered as an unspoken option, something that could be revived under the right conditions. Thus, the Great Fire transformed Christianity's status within the Roman world. The faith emerged from obscurity into official awareness, marked by suspicion and danger. Nero had failed to destroy Christianity, but he had ensured it would never again be invisible. In the decades following Nero's death, Roman policy toward Christians remained inconsistent and uncertain. Emperors such as Vespasian, Titus, and Domitian focused primarily on restoring order after civil war and suppressing political threats. Christianity was not a central concern. Yet Nero's precedent meant that local authorities could act against Christians if they believed public order or religious harmony was at risk. This ambiguity is best illustrated by the correspondence between Pliny the Younger and Emperor Trajan in the early 2nd century. Pliny, serving as governor in Bithynia, wrote to Trajan asking how to deal with Christians. His uncertainty revealed the lasting impact of Nero's actions. Christians were known, disliked, and feared, but there was no clear law against them. Trajan's response reflected cautious pragmatism. Christians were not to be actively hunted, but if accused and proven to refuse Roman religious practices, they were to be punished. This policy balanced restraint with authority. It avoided Nero's excess while preserving the idea that Christianity was incompatible with Roman civic life. The roots of this policy can be traced directly to the Great Fire. Nero had demonstrated that Christians could be used as scapegoats during crisis. Later emperors learned to use pressure more selectively. Persecution became sporadic, local, and conditional rather than theatrical and imperial. For Christians, this ambiguity created constant insecurity. They were tolerated in quiet times and vulnerable in moments of stress. Fires, plagues, invasions, and economic hardship could all revive suspicion. The memory of Nero hovered in the background, reminding believers that acceptance could quickly turn into violence. Thus, the legacy of the Great Fire was not continuous persecution, but permanent uncertainty. Christianity existed in a legal gray zone shaped by fear, memory, and precedent. While Roman officials remembered Nero as a failed ruler, Christians remembered him as something more symbolic, the first imperial enemy of their faith. Over time, this memory took on theological meaning. Nero was no longer merely a historical figure. He became an archetype of worldly power opposed to divine truth. Christian writers preserve stories of martyrdom linked to the fire, even when historical details blurred. Peter and Paul, the most prominent apostles, were traditionally believed to have been executed during Nero's reign. Whether or not their deaths were directly connected to the fire, they became woven into a single narrative of persecution and witness. This process of memory building was deliberate. By remembering Nero as a persecutor, Christians defined themselves as a community shaped by suffering. The fire became a moment of revelation. Rome's power was exposed as cruel and temporary, while faith endured. Nero's palace crumbled. Martyr stories spread. Some later Christian texts even associated Nero with apocalyptic imagery. Rumors circulated that he had not truly died and would return as a destroyer. These legends reflected deep trauma and unresolved fear. Nero symbolized chaos, fire, and persecution. Everything Christians believed their faith had survived. In this way, the Great Fire lived on not only in Roman history, but in Christian identity. It marked the moment when Christianity stepped fully onto the stage of imperial history, defined not by tolerance, but by resistance. The irony is profound. Nero sought to protect his legacy by blaming Christians. Instead, he ensured that his name would forever be remembered through Christian memory, as a warning, a villain, and a symbol of failed power. The Great Fire of Rome fundamentally altered how the Roman state understood disaster. Before 64 CE, fires were treated largely as local problems, frequent, dangerous, but not transformative. The scale of destruction under Nero forced a new realization. Urban catastrophe could threaten imperial legitimacy itself. As a result, fire prevention was no longer merely a municipal concern. It became a matter of state policy. One of the most lasting outcomes of the fire was the expansion and professionalization of the vigiles. Rome's firefighting and night watch force. Originally established under Augustus, the vigiles had been underfunded and poorly equipped. After the fire, emperors invested more heavily in their training, organization, and infrastructure. Firefighting stations were distributed more strategically across the city, and night patrols became more systematic. Urban planning also reflected this new priority. Building codes introduced under Nero were maintained and enforced by later emperors. Wider streets reduced the spread of fire, while restrictions on wooden construction lowered risk. Porticos and open spaces acted as buffers, limiting the ability of flames to leap from structure to structure. These measures represented an early form of disaster mitigation, shaped by painful experience rather than abstract theory. Importantly, these reforms were not purely technical. They carried political meaning. By preventing future fires, emperors sought to prevent future crises of legitimacy. A city that burned uncontrollably reflected poorly on its ruler. Fire became a test of governance, and prevention became a symbol of competence. Thus, the Great Fire transformed Roman administration. It taught the empire that disaster could no longer be left to chance. The state assumed responsibility not only for punishment and conquest, but for safety and prevention, an enduring legacy of Rome's darkest night. The Great Fire also reshaped expectations of how emperors should behave during emergencies. Nero's response, marked by suspicion, scapegoating, and spectacle, became a negative example studied implicitly by later rulers. From this failure emerged a new model of crisis management grounded in visibility, restraint, and public reassurance. Later emperors understood that absence during disaster could be interpreted as indifference, while excessive self-promotion could provoke resentment. Balance became essential. Emperors were expected to be seen aiding victims, coordinating relief, and restoring order, without appearing to exploit tragedy for personal gain. Public communication played an increasing role. Official announcements, coinage, and monuments emphasized restoration rather than blame. Where Nero had accused Christians, later emperors avoided collective scapegoating unless absolutely necessary. The memory of backlash made caution politically wise. This shift did not reflect moral enlightenment so much as political learning. Nero had demonstrated that fear could not permanently replace trust. Crisis required empathy as well as authority. An emperor who failed to embody both risked rebellion. Thus, the Great Fire influenced not only infrastructure but imperial psychology. It reshaped how rulers understood their relationship with the populace. Power was no longer just command, it was reassurance. Over time, the Great Fire of Rome became a reference point for understanding disaster across the empire. Later historians, administrators, and political thinkers treated it as a case study in failure and reform. When plagues struck, when cities burned, or when rebellions erupted, comparisons to 64C inevitably followed. The fire taught Rome that disasters expose underlying weaknesses. Poor housing, social inequality, religious tension, and political mistrust all fed the flames. Nero's response revealed how easily crisis could turn into repression. Later rulers sought to address problems before catastrophe, though not always successfully. For historians, the fire offered moral lessons. It illustrated how power, unchecked by accountability, could deepen suffering. It also showed how memory outlives monuments. Nero rebuilt Rome, but history remembered the fire. Thus, the Great Fire became more than an event. It became a model, a warning embedded in Roman political consciousness. Every emperor who followed ruled in its shadow, aware that a single night could define a reign. The way the Great Fire of Rome has been remembered owes more to historians than to emperors. Among them, Tacitus stands as the most influential voice. Writing several decades after the fire, during the reigns of the Flavian and Trajanic emperors, Tacitus approached the event not merely as a chronicler of facts, but as a moral historian concerned with power, corruption, and responsibility. His account in the Annals shaped how generations would understand both the fire and Nero's role in it. Tacitus presents the fire with careful ambiguity. He acknowledges widespread rumors that Nero ordered the blaze, yet he stops short of declaring this as fact. This restraint is significant. Tacitus was deeply critical of tyrannical emperors, but he also valued credibility. His uncertainty highlights the limitations of historical knowledge, even in antiquity. At the same time, by recording the rumors at all, he ensured they would never disappear. What gives Tacitus's account lasting power is its moral framing. The fire is not just a disaster. It is a revelation of character. Nero's response, relief efforts combined with persecution, becomes a lens through which imperial power is judged. Tacitus's description of Christian suffering is particularly striking. Though no supporter of Christianity, he portrays the punishments as excessive, provoking sympathy despite general hostility toward the victims. This subtle critique transforms the episode into an indictment of cruelty. Tacitus also situates the fire within a broader narrative of decline. Rome's suffering reflects moral decay at the top. The emperor's failure to command trust becomes more important than the physical cause of the fire. In this way, history becomes ethical commentary. Because Tacitus wrote with literary skill and political insight, his version of events outlived competing accounts. Later historians drew upon him, reinforcing his interpretation. Thus, the Great Fire entered Western historical memory not simply as an urban catastrophe, but as a symbol of tyrannical failure, filtered through Tacitus's pen. While Tacitus emphasized moral judgment, other ancient writers contributed to a more sensational image of Nero and the fire. Suetonius, in his Lives of the Caesars, and Cassius Dio, writing in the 3rd century, offered vivid, dramatic portrayals that amplified Nero's reputation for madness and excess. Their accounts, though historically valuable, blurred the line between fact, rumor, and literary exaggeration. Suetonius presents Nero as a performer obsessed with spectacle, allegedly singing as Rome burned. His work focuses on personal scandal, shocking behavior, and psychological portraiture. The fire becomes part of a broader narrative of deviance. Accuracy is less important than character. Nero is not simply a bad ruler. He is a grotesque figure whose actions violate social norms. Cassius Dio goes even further, writing long after Nero's death, when condemnation was safe and expected. His descriptions of the fire and persecution emphasize chaos, cruelty, and imperial arrogance. Over time, these accounts hardened in a popular memory, reinforcing the image of Nero as the archetypal tyrant. These writers shaped how the fire entered cultural imagination. Their dramatic storytelling ensured the event would be remembered vividly, even if details were uncertain. Sensation replaced nuance, but memory became unforgettable. Together, Tacitus, Suetonius, and Dio created a layered historical tradition. Fact, interpretation, and moral lesson intertwined. The Great Fire became not just history, but story, retold to warn, to condemn, and to fascinate. The Great Fire of Rome did not remain confined to ancient history. Through Roman historians and later Christian writers, it entered the broader cultural memory of the Western world. Medieval chroniclers Renaissance scholars and modern historians all return to the fire as a moment when power, disaster, and morality collided. Christian tradition preserved the fire as a foundational trauma. It symbolized the first great clash between imperial authority and Christian faith. Nero became a recurring symbol of evil rule, invoked in sermons, theology, and apocalyptic thought. The fire thus shaped not only history, but belief. In modern times, the phrase "fiddling while Rome burns" has entered common language, detached from historical accuracy, but rich in metaphor. It represents leadership failure, distraction during crisis, and moral blindness. This enduring image testifies to the fire's symbolic power. The Great Fire became a template for understanding catastrophe. Historians examine it to explore how societies respond to disaster, how blame is assigned, and how memory is constructed. It remains relevant because it reveals timeless patterns: fear, rumor, scapegoating, and the struggle for legitimacy. Thus, the fire of 64 CE continues to burn, not in streets, but in words. It survives because it speaks to universal questions about power and responsibility. Nero's Rome may be gone, but its lessons endure. Unlike legends or literary accusations, archaeology offers a different kind of testimony: silent, physical, and resistant to exaggeration. Over the past 2 centuries, excavations across Rome have uncovered compelling material evidence that confirms the scale and violence of the Great Fire of 64 CE. Burned layers, collapsed structures, and sudden changes in urban design all point to a city that experienced a catastrophic and widespread inferno rather than a series of isolated blazes. Archaeologists have identified thick layers of ash and char debris in multiple parts of Rome, especially around the Palatine Hill, the Circus Maximus, and the Esquiline district. These layers are often sharply defined, suggesting a sudden destructive event rather than gradual decay. In many cases, burned remains lie directly beneath structures built shortly after Nero's reign, providing clear chronological markers. Coins, pottery, and building materials found within these layers align with the mid-1st century CE, reinforcing the historical timeline described by ancient sources. Equally significant is what disappeared. Entire neighborhoods vanished from the archaeological record, replaced by redesigned streets and new construction methods. Pre-fire Rome was chaotic and irregular. Post-fire Rome was more structured, reflecting the new urban regulations imposed after 64 CE. This transformation supports historical accounts that describe not only destruction, but a deliberate effort to rebuild differently. Importantly, archaeology does not reveal intent. It cannot tell us who started the fire or why. What it does confirm is magnitude. The fire was not exaggerated by hostile historians. It was one of the most devastating urban disasters in ancient history. This physical reality gives weight to the psychological and political upheaval described in texts. Thus, archaeology anchors the Great Fire in undeniable fact. Regardless of Nero's guilt or innocence, Rome truly burned on a massive scale, and its ruins still speak across centuries. One of the most striking archaeological consequences of the Great Fire is how thoroughly it reshaped Rome's architectural identity. Excavations reveal a sharp contrast between pre-fire and post-fire construction. Earlier buildings relied heavily on wood, narrow alleys, and ad hoc planning. After the fire, brick and concrete became dominant, streets widened, and building alignments grew more uniform. Nero's rebuilding program left a clear material footprint. The use of concrete vaulting, standardized brickwork, and regulated spacing between buildings reflects centralized planning rather than organic growth. These changes match historical descriptions of new building codes designed to reduce fire risk and impose order. The remains of the Domus Aurea provide further insight. Though much of it was deliberately buried by later emperors, excavated sections reveal extraordinary artistic innovation. Frescoes, spatial design, and engineering techniques show that Nero's architectural ambitions were genuine and advanced. Archaeology thus complicates the moral narrative. Nero was not merely destructive, he was also creative, though his creativity came at immense social cost. Later construction projects, especially under the Flavians, deliberately built over Nero's structures. The Colosseum's foundations sit atop the filled-in lake of the Domus Aurea. This physical overriding reflects political intent to erase Nero's presence and reclaim the city for public use. Archaeology captures this struggle for memory in stone. In this way, Rome itself became a palimpsest of power. Each layer tells a story of ambition, backlash, and reinterpretation. The Great Fire did not end with rebuilding. It initiated a long contest over how the city and its past would be remembered. Despite its value, archaeology has limits. It cannot confirm whether Nero ordered the fire, nor can it reveal the emotions, rumors, or fears that shaped public response. These elements belong to human experience, preserved imperfectly in texts and traditions. As a result, historians must combine material evidence with literary sources, weighing bias against physical reality. Some modern scholars argue that the fire was likely accidental, a result of Rome's flammable urban environment. Others suggest that even if Nero did not order it, his response intensified suspicion and resentment. Archaeology supports neither position conclusively, reminding us that history is often reconstructed from incomplete evidence. What archaeology does reveal is consequence. The fire altered Rome permanently. Urban planning, imperial ideology, and religious politics all changed as a result. These transformations are visible in brick, street layouts, and public monuments. Thus, archaeology does not solve the mystery of blame, but it confirms the scale of impact. The Great Fire was real, devastating, and transformative. Its legacy lies not in a single act, but in the chain of responses it triggered. In the end, the truth of the Great Fire resides between ash and word. Archaeology grounds history, while texts interpret it. Together, they allow us to approach, not fully grasp, but meaningfully understand the night Rome burned. Urban disasters were not rare in the ancient world. Fires, earthquakes, floods, and plagues regularly struck major cities such as Alexandria, Antioch, Carthage, and Ephesus. Yet the Great Fire of Rome in 64 CE occupies a unique place in history. Its significance lies not only in its scale, but in the political, cultural, and symbolic consequences that followed. To understand why this fire reshaped history, it must be placed alongside other ancient catastrophes. Many ancient cities burned repeatedly. Rome itself had suffered earlier fires, including one in 6 CE and others during the Republic. However, those disasters occurred in a different political context. By 64 CE, Rome was no longer just a city. It was the symbolic heart of a vast empire ruled by a single man. Any catastrophe in Rome therefore reflected directly on imperial authority. When Rome burned, the empire felt it. Other disasters lacked this concentration of symbolism. Earthquakes in Asia Minor destroyed entire cities. Yet those events did not usually threaten the legitimacy of the emperor. Reconstruction could be framed as generosity from the center to the periphery. Rome's fire, by contrast, exposed weakness at the very core of power. The emperor could not distance himself from it. Timing also mattered. The fire occurred during a period of political tension, social inequality, and religious change. Nero's unconventional rule, combined with existing elite resentment, meant that disaster was interpreted through suspicion. In contrast, disasters under respected rulers were often seen as misfortune rather than moral failure. Thus, the Great Fire was not merely bigger, it was politically explosive. It intersected with leadership crisis, urban vulnerability, and cultural anxiety in a way few other ancient disasters did. Rome burned at the wrong moment, under the wrong ruler, in the wrong symbolic place. The Great Fire of Rome became a reference point for later urban planning, both within and beyond the Roman world. Its lessons were studied implicitly by administrators who understood that cities were engines of power and vulnerabilities. The reforms introduced after 64 CE influenced how future cities were designed, governed, and protected. Within the Roman Empire, provincial capitals adopted similar building regulations. Brick and stone construction increased, street grids widened, and fire breaks became more common. The idea that the state bore responsibility for urban safety spread gradually. While enforcement varied, the model established in Rome carried authority. Beyond Rome, later civilizations inherited these lessons. Medieval and early modern cities often cited ancient Rome when implementing fire regulations after catastrophic blazes. The Great Fire of London in 1666, for example, prompted reforms strikingly similar to those of Nero's Rome. Wider streets, fire-resistant materials, and centralized planning. Though separated by centuries, the logic was the same. Rome also influenced how disasters were narrated. The idea that catastrophe reveals moral and political truth, so prominent in accounts of Nero, became a recurring theme in historical writing. Fires were no longer just accidents. They were judgments on leadership. Thus, the Great Fire's legacy extended far beyond antiquity. It contributed to a long tradition of learning from destruction, shaping how societies respond to urban crisis. Not every catastrophe becomes history-defining. Many disasters fade into obscurity, remembered only locally or briefly. The Great Fire of Rome endured because it intersected with power, narrative, and memory in a rare and potent combination. First, it involved a controversial ruler whose character amplified interpretation. Nero's reputation ensured that the fire would be moralized rather than forgotten. Second, it affected a city that symbolized an entire civilization. Rome's suffering mattered everywhere the empire reached. Third, it produced victims, especially Christians, whose memory traditions preserved the event with emotional intensity. Finally, the fire changed things. It altered urban design, religious policy, imperial image, and historical consciousness. Disasters that do not produce transformation tend to fade. The Great Fire transformed Rome. In this sense, history remembers not flames, but consequences. The fire burned for days. Its meaning burned for centuries. That is why it still matters. Long after the political realities of the 1st century CE faded, Emperor Nero continued to live on in the imagination of later generations. This survival was not historical in the strict sense, but symbolic. Nero gradually transformed from a flawed Roman ruler into an archetype of evil leadership. The Great Fire of Rome played a central role in this transformation, serving as the dramatic centerpiece around which myth, memory, and moral judgment coalesced. In late antiquity and the medieval period, historical nuance gave way to moral storytelling. Nero was no longer debated as possibly guilty or innocent of arson. He was simply assumed to be responsible. His alleged performance while Rome burned became emblematic of a ruler detached from reality, more concerned with art and ego than human suffering. The fire thus evolved from an event into a parable. This transformation was aided by the collapse of Roman political continuity. As imperial institutions fell and new Christianized societies emerged, Nero's image was reshaped to serve new moral frameworks. He was remembered not as a Roman emperor among many, but as the persecutor, the first to unleash state violence against Christianity. In this narrative, the Great Fire was not an accident or a political crisis. It was divine exposure of tyranny. The simplification of Nero's character was essential to this myth-making. Complex motivations, administrative actions, and structural weaknesses of Rome were stripped away. What remained was a clear moral contrast: innocent victims and a monstrous ruler. Nero became useful as a warning rather than as a subject of analysis. Thus, history gave way to legend. The Great Fire burned away ambiguity, leaving behind a figure shaped by fear, outrage, and moral instruction. Nero's continued relevance depended not on facts, but on symbolism, and in that realm, the fire was eternal. One of the most striking developments in Nero's posthumous reputation was his association with apocalyptic evil. In early Christian thought, Nero became linked to the figure of the Antichrist, a cosmic enemy destined to oppose God before the end of time. This association reveals how deeply the trauma of persecution and fire had embedded itself in Christian consciousness. Several factors contributed to this belief. First, rumors circulated shortly after Nero's death that he had not truly died and would return. These rumors, known as the Nero Redivivus legend, persisted for decades. In a world accustomed to sudden reversals of fortune, the idea of Nero's return felt plausible and terrifying. Second, numerological interpretations of Scripture reinforced the association. Some early Christians interpreted the number 666 in the book of Revelation as a coded reference to Nero's name when transliterated into Hebrew letters. Whether intended by the author or not, this interpretation gained traction, cementing Nero's role as a symbolic enemy of divine order. The Great Fire strengthened this association. Fire, destruction, and persecution aligned seamlessly with apocalyptic imagery. Nero was remembered not only as a tyrant, but as a force of chaos whose reign represented moral collapse. His palace, his flames, and his cruelty became signs of an age opposed to God. This transformation reveals how historical trauma becomes theological meaning. Nero's actions, real or perceived, were elevated into cosmic struggle. The fire of Rome became a foretaste of final judgment, and Nero its human agent. Thus, Nero crossed the boundary between history and myth. He became timeless, reappearing whenever communities sought to personify evil power. The Great Fire ensured that his name would never fade into obscurity. It would burn in the imagination of faith. From medieval chronicles to modern novels and films, Nero has remained a compelling figure. Artists and writers have repeatedly returned to the image of Rome in flames, drawn by its dramatic intensity and moral clarity. The Great Fire serves as a visual and narrative anchor, allowing creators to explore themes of power, decadence, and responsibility. In Renaissance and Enlightenment thought, Nero symbolized the dangers of absolute power unchecked by reason. Philosophers and political theorists cited him as evidence that tyranny leads inevitably to disaster. The fire was no longer just ancient history. It was a lesson for all ages. In modern culture, the phrase "Nero fiddling while Rome burns" encapsulates this lesson succinctly. Though historically inaccurate, it expresses a universal fear: leaders who ignore crisis in favor of self-interest. The persistence of this metaphor demonstrates how thoroughly Nero's image has been shaped by the fire. Popular media continues to reinforce this portrayal. Films and television series often depict Nero as sadistic and mad, the fire as deliberate spectacle. While historians challenge these depictions, their emotional power endures. Nero is compelling precisely because he represents failure at the highest level. Thus, the Great Fire of Rome has transcended history. It has become a cultural touchstone, a symbol invoked whenever leadership collapses under ego and neglect. Nero's Rome still burns, not in fact, but in imagination. In modern historical scholarship, Nero has become a subject of reassessment rather than automatic condemnation. Unlike ancient historians, contemporary scholars are acutely aware of bias, political context, and the limitations of surviving sources. As a result, Nero is no longer examined solely as a villain, but as a complex ruler operating within a volatile imperial system. The Great Fire of Rome sits at the center of this reevaluation. Modern historians begin by questioning the reliability of ancient accounts. Tacitus, Suetonius, and Cassius Dio were not neutral observers. They wrote under later emperors who benefited from Nero's disgrace. Condemning Nero helped legitimize new regimes and distance them from Julio-Claudian excess. This does not mean their accounts are false, but it does require careful scrutiny. When evidence is weighed critically, direct proof that Nero ordered the fire remains absent. No contemporary documents, inscriptions, or archaeological findings confirm imperial arson. What survives are rumors, interpretations, and hostile narratives. Tacitus himself admits uncertainty, noting that accusations existed but could not be conclusively verified. For modern historians, this hesitation matters greatly. Scholars also reassess Nero's response to the fire. Archaeological and textual evidence confirms that he organized relief, opened public spaces, and implemented lasting urban reforms. These actions do not align easily with the image of a ruler indifferent to suffering. While they do not prove innocence, they complicate simplistic narratives. Thus, modern reassessment does not seek to rehabilitate Nero, but to understand him. The Great Fire becomes less a crime scene and more a mirror reflecting political anxiety, social tension, and historical bias. Nero emerges not as a cartoon tyrant, but as a flawed ruler overwhelmed by crisis. Another key insight of modern scholarship is the recognition that the Great Fire of Rome was not solely the result of individual action, but of systemic failure. Rome in the 1st century CE was an accident waiting to happen. Its dense population, wooden buildings, narrow streets, and reliance on open flames created perfect conditions for disaster. From this perspective, responsibility becomes collective rather than personal. Emperors before Nero had failed to address Rome's structural vulnerability, and earlier fires had already demonstrated the danger. Nero inherited a city shaped by centuries of unregulated growth. The fire exposed problems long ignored. Modern historians emphasize that ancient societies lacked the technological and administrative capacity to fully prevent such disasters. Firefighting was rudimentary, building codes weakly enforced, and emergency response limited. In this context, blaming Nero alone oversimplifies reality. This structural interpretation does not absolve Nero of political responsibility, but shifts emphasis. His failure lay not necessarily in causing the fire, but in managing its aftermath and perception. The persecution of Christians, the extravagance of the Domus Aurea, and his strained relationship with elites magnified suspicion. Nero became the face of disaster because he embodied its political consequences. Thus, modern history reframes the Great Fire as a convergence of vulnerability, fear, and leadership crisis. Nero's guilt becomes less clear-cut, while Rome's systemic fragility becomes undeniable. The final question modern historians confront is not simply what Nero did, but how he should be remembered. Should history condemn him absolutely, or approach him with cautious understanding? The answer lies somewhere between judgment and empathy. Nero was undoubtedly responsible for acts of cruelty, repression, and political mismanagement. His persecution of Christians, regardless of motive, inflicted real suffering. His prioritization of personal ambition over political stability contributed to his downfall. These facts demand moral judgment. Yet historical understanding requires resisting myth. Nero did not rule alone, nor did he operate outside historical constraints. He was shaped by an autocratic system that concentrated power, rewarded spectacle, and punished weakness. The Great Fire exposed these structural flaws as much as Nero's character. Thus, modern history seeks balance. Nero is neither innocent nor uniquely evil. He was a ruler whose reign revealed the dangers of absolute power under crisis. The fire did not make him a tyrant. It revealed what tyranny looks like when tested by catastrophe. In this sense, the Great Fire of Rome becomes less about blame and more about warning. It teaches that leadership is judged most harshly not by intention, but by consequence. Nero's legacy endures because the fire forced Rome and history to confront that truth. Across human history, certain disasters have transcended their immediate destruction and reshaped civilizations. The Great Fire of Rome belongs to this category, alongside events such as the destruction of Athens during the Peloponnesian War, the fall of Baghdad in 1258, the Black Death in medieval Europe, and the Great Fire of London in 1666. What unites these events is not merely devastation, but transformation. They altered political systems, cultural identities, and historical trajectories. In comparative perspective, Rome's fire stands out because it struck the symbolic and administrative heart of an empire at its height. When Baghdad fell, it marked the end of Abbasid dominance. When London burned, it transformed urban planning and governance. Rome's fire did something equally profound. It exposed the vulnerability of imperial power itself. Unlike peripheral disasters, this catastrophe could not be dismissed as distant misfortune. It unfolded at the center of authority, forcing immediate political reckoning. Another critical similarity lies in leadership response. In nearly every civilization-shaping disaster, historical judgment focuses less on the event itself than on how leaders responded. Pericles' strategy during plague, medieval rulers' reactions to the Black Death, and London's reconstruction under Charles II are remembered because leadership decisions amplified or mitigated suffering. Nero's response placed him firmly within this global pattern. His perceived detachment, scapegoating, and extravagance turned disaster into indictment. Yet Rome's fire differs in one crucial respect. It became inseparable from a single individual's legacy. Many disasters are associated with eras or systems. The Great Fire of Rome became Nero's fire. This personalization of catastrophe intensified its moral and historical impact. Thus, in global perspective, Rome's fire represents a universal lesson. Cities burn. Civilizations endure only if leadership adapts. Where adaptation fails, disaster becomes destiny. One of the most consistent patterns across world history is that disaster functions as a test of political legitimacy. In moments of prosperity, power can hide behind ceremony and success. In crisis, illusion collapses. The Great Fire of Rome revealed truths about imperial governance that years of stability had concealed. Disasters strip authority of its protective layers. Administrative inefficiency becomes visible. Social inequality becomes explosive. Religious tension intensifies. Nero ruled an empire already strained by class divisions, elite resentment, and cultural transformation. The fire did not create these problems. It illuminated them. This phenomenon appears repeatedly in history. The Black Death exposed feudal fragility. The Lisbon earthquake of 1755 challenged Enlightenment optimism and religious certainty. Modern disasters, from hurricanes to nuclear accidents, continue to test governments in similar ways. Rome's fire fits squarely into this pattern. What makes Nero's case especially instructive is the role of narrative control. Nero attempted to manage perception through blame and spectacle. This strategy failed because it contradicted lived experience. People who suffer do not accept narratives that deny their reality. When leadership loses narrative credibility, authority collapses rapidly. Thus, the Great Fire teaches that power is not maintained by force alone. It requires trust. Nero lost trust not because the city burned, but because his response deepened fear and resentment. In this sense, the fire was not merely physical, it was political combustion. Despite its devastation, the Great Fire of Rome did not end Roman civilization. Instead, it marked a turning point that led to renewal, reform, and redefinition. This outcome reflects another global pattern. Civilizations rarely collapse immediately after disaster. They adapt, often becoming stronger in structure, but more cautious in spirit. Rome rebuilt with improved infrastructure, stricter regulations, and renewed emphasis on public order. Later emperors learned from Nero's failures, prioritizing stability over spectacle. Christianity, forged through persecution, emerged stronger and more organized. Even imperial ideology evolved, emphasizing service rather than performance. Yet renewal came at a cost. The fire permanently altered Rome's self-image. Confidence gave way to anxiety. The sense of invulnerability that had defined early imperial Rome never fully returned. This psychological shift is as important as any architectural reform. Civilizations shaped by disaster remember fragility. This dual legacy, renewal paired with caution, is the hallmark of civilization after fire. Rome survived, but it ruled differently. Authority became more defensive, more aware of its limits. Memory replaced certainty. Thus, the Great Fire of Rome belongs among history's defining disasters, not because it destroyed civilization, but because it reshaped how civilization understood itself. Fire did not end Rome. It changed what Rome believed it was. One of the most profound consequences of the Great Fire of Rome was not architectural or administrative, but ideological. The catastrophe permanently altered how Roman society understood the role of the emperor. Before Nero, imperial authority had gradually evolved from the Augustan model of restrained leadership into a more personalized and performative style. Nero pushed this trend further than any predecessor, presenting himself as artist, entertainer, and cultural icon. The fire exposed the dangers of this model. In the Roman political imagination after 64 CE, the emperor could no longer be primarily a performer. Crisis demanded protection, stability, and restraint. Nero's fascination with spectacle, whether real or exaggerated by hostile sources, became a cautionary example. The image of an emperor absorbed in personal expression while the city burned crystallized public anxiety about misplaced priorities at the highest level of power. Subsequent emperors consciously redefined their public image. Vespasian and his successors emphasized practical virtues: discipline, moderation, military competence, and concern for public welfare. They appeared less frequently in extravagant ceremonies and more often as administrators and judges. This shift was not accidental. It was a direct response to the memory of Nero and the fire. This dual legacy, renewal paired with caution, is the hallmark of civilization after fire. Rome survived, but it ruled differently. Authority became more defensive, more aware of its limits. Memory replaced certainty. Thus, the Great Fire of Rome belongs among history's defining disasters, not because it destroyed civilization, but because it reshaped how civilization understood itself. Fire did not end Rome. It changed what Rome believed it was. One of the most profound consequences of the Great Fire of Rome was not architectural or administrative, but ideological. The catastrophe permanently altered how Roman society understood the role of the emperor. Before Nero, imperial authority had gradually evolved from the Augustan model of restrained leadership into a more personalized and performative style. Nero pushed this trend further than any predecessor, presenting himself as artist, entertainer, and cultural icon. The fire exposed the dangers of this model. In the Roman political imagination after 64 CE, the emperor could no longer be primarily a performer. Crisis demanded protection, stability, and restraint. Nero's fascination with spectacle, whether real or exaggerated by hostile sources, became a cautionary example. The image of an emperor absorbed in personal expression while the city burned crystallized public anxiety about misplaced priorities at the highest level of power. Subsequent emperors consciously redefined their public image. Vespasian and his successors emphasized practical virtues: discipline, moderation, military competence, and concern for public welfare. They appeared less frequently in extravagant ceremonies and more often as administrators and judges. This shift was not accidental. It was a direct response to the memory of Nero and the fire. Imperial propaganda reinforced this transformation. Coins, inscriptions, and monuments depicted emperors as restorers, restaurateurs, guardians of order, and servants of the state. The language of rule shifted away from personal glory toward collective stability. The emperor became protector rather than star. This ideological recalibration reflected a deeper lesson learned from disaster. When catastrophe strikes, society judges leadership not by brilliance, but by reliability. The Great Fire taught Rome that imperial authority must be grounded in responsibility. Nero's reign demonstrated what happened when that grounding failed. The Great Fire also reshaped how emperors governed an empire psychologically marked by trauma. Romans who had witnessed destruction, persecution, and civil war carried lasting fear. Governing such a population required sensitivity to perception and memory. Later emperors understood that legitimacy could be undermined as much by symbolic missteps as by policy failure. As a result, imperial rule became more cautious. Public works emphasized utility and shared benefit rather than personal indulgence. Large-scale building projects continued, but they were framed as gifts to the people rather than expressions of imperial ego. The Colosseum, baths, roads, and aqueducts all served practical functions while reinforcing imperial generosity. Religious policy also reflected caution. While traditional Roman religion remained central, emperors avoided dramatic confrontations with minority groups unless politically unavoidable. Nero's persecution of Christians had demonstrated that scapegoating could backfire. creating martyrs rather than restoring trust. Later rulers preferred ambiguity, tolerating difference as long as public order remained intact. The trauma of the fire also influenced succession politics. Emperors became more aware that instability at the top could trigger empire-wide chaos. While succession crises still occurred, there was growing recognition that smooth transitions mattered deeply. The memory of Nero's fall and the civil wars that followed reinforced this lesson. Thus, the Great Fire produced a more defensive and pragmatic imperial system. Authority did not become kinder, but it became more careful. The empire learned that power exercised without sensitivity to public memory was fragile. Even generations after his death, Nero remained a reference point in Roman political thought. His reign became a negative template against which later emperors measured themselves. To rule well was implicitly to rule unlike Nero. The Great Fire ensured that his failures would remain central to this comparison. Roman writers and orators invoked Nero's name to warn against excess, cruelty, and self-absorption. Emperors who wished to present themselves as virtuous emphasized contrast, simplicity over luxury, justice over fear, order over chaos. Nero's memory functioned as a political boundary marker, defining what imperial behavior should not be. This dynamic illustrates an important historical principle. Failure can shape institutions as powerfully as success. Nero did not reform the empire intentionally. His mistakes forced reform through reaction. The Great Fire amplified those mistakes, ensuring they could not be ignored. Over time, the empire stabilized, but it never forgot the lesson. Crisis revealed truth. Leadership would always be judged most harshly in moments of disaster. Nero's Rome burned, but from its ashes emerged a more restrained vision of imperial authority. Thus, the Great Fire was not only an ending, but a beginning. It marked the transition from one model of emperorship to another, less flamboyant, more guarded, and forever shaped by the memory of a city in flames. The persecution that followed the Great Fire of Rome marked a decisive turning point in the internal development of Christianity. Before 64 CE, Christian belief was diverse, loosely organized, and still closely connected to Jewish tradition. The violence unleashed under Nero forced the Christian community to confront suffering on an unprecedented scale, transforming trauma into theology and fear into meaning. Persecution compelled Christians to reinterpret their faith in existential terms. The death of believers was no longer an abstract possibility, but a lived reality. In response, Christian thinkers increasingly emphasized themes of endurance, sacrifice, and redemptive suffering. The crucifixion of Jesus, already central to belief, took on intensified significance as a model for faithful endurance under oppression. Suffering was reframed not as divine punishment, but as participation in Christ's own sacrifice. This theological shift was not purely intellectual. It was rooted in lived experience. Families were torn apart, leaders executed, and communities driven underground. In such conditions, theology became survival strategy. Belief offered coherence in chaos and dignity in death. Martyrdom narratives emerged as a way to preserve memory and instill courage. The stories of those who died under Nero were retold, shaping a collective identity forged in fire. Importantly, this reinterpretation of suffering distinguished Christianity from surrounding religious traditions. Where Roman religion sought to appease gods to avoid disaster, Christianity taught that faithfulness might invite suffering. This radical idea gave believers psychological resilience. Disaster no longer meant abandonment by God. it became confirmation of faith's truth. Thus, Nero's persecution unintentionally strengthened Christianity's theological core by forcing believers to confront death and injustice. It accelerated the development of doctrines that would sustain the faith for centuries. The fire burned bodies, but it refined belief. Beyond theology, persecution reshaped the organizational structure of Christianity. Before Nero, Christian communities were decentralized, informal, and fluid. Leadership roles existed, but were loosely defined. The threat of arrest and execution forced greater clarity, discipline, and hierarchy. Under pressure, Christians needed reliable leadership to coordinate aid, preserve teachings, and maintain unity. Bishops and elders assumed clearer authority, acting as spiritual and administrative anchors. Lines of succession gained importance, ensuring continuity even when leaders were killed. Written texts, letters, gospels, and teachings were copied and circulated more deliberately to preserve doctrine. Persecution also reinforced boundaries. The distinction between believers and non-believers sharpened. Commitment deepened. Conversion became a serious, often dangerous choice rather than a casual affiliation. This intensity strengthened cohesion and trust within the community. Ironically, repression also increased Christianity's visibility. Public executions and rumors attracted attention. Observers who witnessed believers endure suffering without renouncing faith were often deeply affected. Some converted not despite persecution, but because of it. The courage of martyrs challenged Roman assumptions about power and loyalty. Thus, organizational growth accompanied theological development. Christianity emerged from Nero's persecution more unified, disciplined, and resilient. What began as a scattered movement became an institution capable of surviving hostility and expanding quietly across the empire. Nero intended to destroy Christianity by associating it with catastrophe and terror. Instead, he provided the movement with one of its most powerful founding narratives. The paradox is striking. Imperial violence accelerated the rise of a faith that would eventually outlast the empire itself. By targeting Christians as a group, Nero gave them a shared identity recognized by the state. By executing them publicly, he transformed obscure believers into witnesses whose deaths carried meaning. By attempting to erase them, he ensured they would be remembered. This paradox reflects a broader historical pattern. Persecution often strengthens belief by clarifying values, intensifying commitment, and exposing moral contrasts. In Rome, the contrast between imperial cruelty and Christian endurance proved especially potent. The empire claimed absolute power. Christians demonstrated a loyalty that transcended fear. Over time, Nero's name became inseparable from this narrative. He was remembered not for restoring Rome, but for opposing a faith that would eventually reshape Western civilization. His fire illuminated the limits of coercion and the unpredictability of historical consequence. Thus, the Great Fire of Rome did more than destroy a city. It catalyzed a transformation whose effects reached far beyond Nero's lifetime. Christianity emerged stronger, more defined, and more prepared for the long struggle ahead. In the decades following Nero's death, Roman emperors faced an unresolved problem: how to deal with Christianity. Nero's actions after the Great Fire had thrust the religion into imperial consciousness, but they had not resolved the tension between Roman authority and Christian belief. Instead, his persecution created a lasting memory that shaped imperial policy through caution, hesitation, and contradiction. Later emperors were acutely aware of Nero's reputation. His name had become synonymous with excess, cruelty, and failure. As a result, few rulers wished to imitate his theatrical violence. Even emperors who distrusted Christians understood that large-scale persecution risked political backlash and moral condemnation. Nero's failure demonstrated that repression could create sympathy for victims rather than loyalty to the state. This awareness produced a pattern of inconsistent enforcement. Christianity was not legalized, but neither was it systematically eradicated. Governors were given discretion. Christians could live quietly if they avoided public confrontation, but they remained vulnerable during moments of crisis. Fires, plagues, military defeats, or economic hardship could still revive accusations that Christians angered the gods. The shadow of the Great Fire loomed over every such decision. Nero's attempt to explain catastrophe through scapegoating had failed. Later emperors learned that disasters required practical response, not symbolic enemies. As a result, Christianity survived in a legal gray zone for nearly 2 centuries. Thus, Nero's persecution paradoxically limited future persecution. His excess became a warning. Imperial power learned restraint not from moral enlightenment, but from political memory. The fire taught Rome that fear could not be governed indefinitely. Throughout the 2nd and 3rd centuries CE, Christianity continued to grow under conditions of uncertainty shaped by Nero's legacy. Christians were tolerated in practice, but condemned in theory. This contradiction defined their relationship with the Roman state. Local persecutions occurred sporadically, often triggered by social unrest. When disasters struck, familiar accusations resurfaced. Christians rejected the gods, undermined tradition, and endangered society. These claims echoed Nero's original charge after the fire. Yet, unlike Nero, later rulers rarely framed persecution as spectacle. Punishment was selective, administrative, and localized. Christians adapted to this environment. They developed strategies of quiet endurance, legal argument, and philosophical defense. Apologists such as Justin Martyr argued that Christians were loyal subjects who prayed for the emperor and upheld moral order. These arguments directly countered Nero-era accusations of hatred toward humanity. The memory of Nero functioned as both threat and shield. It reminded Christians that persecution was possible, but it also reminded Roman officials that excessive cruelty discredited authority. This tension allowed Christianity to expand gradually, embedding itself within urban communities, families, and professions. Thus, the Great Fire continued to shape lived experience long after the flames died. It established a rhythm of suspicion and survival that defined Christianity's formative centuries. The final irony of Nero's persecution is revealed in the long arc of Roman history. By the early 4th century CE, Christianity had grown too large to ignore. When Emperor Constantine legalized the religion in 313 CE, he did so in a world still shaped by the memory of past persecutions. Nero stood at the beginning of that story. Christian writers framed legalization as divine vindication. The empire that once burned believers now embraced their faith. Nero's fire became the first chapter in a narrative that ended with triumph rather than destruction. Persecution was remembered not as defeat, but as proof of truth. For Rome, this transformation marked a profound shift. Imperial authority adapted to Christian belief, redefining legitimacy itself. The state that once blamed Christians for disaster now invoked their God for protection. The memory of Nero's failure lingered as a warning against violent repression. Thus, the Great Fire of Rome played an indirect role in one of history's greatest transformations. By forcing Christianity into confrontation with imperial power, it set in motion a struggle that reshaped civilization. The Great Fire of Rome in 64 CE must ultimately be understood not as a single moment of destruction, but as a historical catalyst, an event that exposed, accelerated, and transformed forces already present within Roman society. Fires had burned Rome before, and they would burn again, but never with consequences as profound or as far-reaching. This was because the fire occurred at a moment when political authority, urban vulnerability, religious tension, and imperial identity were all under strain. From a purely material perspective, the fire was catastrophic. Vast sections of the city were destroyed, tens of thousands were displaced, and Rome's architectural landscape was permanently altered. Archaeology confirms the scale of devastation, validating ancient accounts of widespread ruin. Yet material destruction alone does not explain why this fire became legendary. What made it decisive was the human response. The fire revealed the limits of imperial control. Nero's authority, already weakened by distrust and unconventional rule, could not withstand the pressure of mass trauma. His relief efforts, though real, were overshadowed by suspicion. His rebuilding projects, though innovative, were interpreted as self-serving. Most critically, his decision to blame Christians transformed a disaster into a moral and political crisis. In this sense, the Great Fire functioned as a mirror. It reflected the fragility of autocratic power when confronted by suffering it could not fully manage or explain. The fire stripped away the illusion that emperors stood above catastrophe. Rome burned, and with it burned the myth of imperial invulnerability. Thus, the fire was not merely destructive, it was revelatory. It revealed structural weakness, political isolation, and the dangers of governing through fear and spectacle. It marked the end of one vision of empire and the beginning of another more cautious, defensive form of rule. No figure is more inseparable from the Great Fire than Nero himself. History has long rendered its verdict: Nero the arsonist, Nero the madman, Nero the persecutor. Yet modern historical understanding demands a more nuanced judgment, one that neither absolves nor simplifies. There is no conclusive evidence that Nero ordered the fire. What survives are rumors recorded by hostile sources writing after his death. Tacitus himself admits uncertainty. Archaeology cannot assign guilt. From a strictly evidentiary standpoint, Nero's direct responsibility remains unproven. Yet historical judgment is not limited to criminal guilt. Nero's failure was not necessarily in starting the fire, but in failing to command trust afterward. His response revealed a ruler isolated from his people, misunderstood by elites, and trapped by his own image. His persecution of Christians, regardless of motive, represents a moral failure that inflicted real suffering and established a dangerous precedent. Nero thus occupies a tragic position in history. He was neither purely monstrous nor merely misunderstood. He was a ruler shaped by an autocratic system that rewarded spectacle and punished vulnerability. When catastrophe struck, that system collapsed around him. History remembers Nero harshly because leadership is judged most severely in crisis. Rome did not forgive him, not because the city burned, but because the fire exposed who he was when tested. His legacy became inseparable from flame, fear, and failure. In this sense, Nero became both actor and symbol. He embodied the dangers of power detached from responsibility, creativity divorced from duty, and authority maintained through terror rather than trust. Nearly 2,000 years after the Great Fire of Rome, its significance endures because it addresses timeless questions about power, disaster, and memory. The event continues to resonate not because of ancient flames, but because of modern relevance. The fire teaches that disaster is never purely natural. While flames may ignite accidentally, their consequences are shaped by human systems. Urban planning, social inequality, political legitimacy, and leadership response. Rome burned because it was vulnerable, and Nero fell because he could not transform authority into reassurance. The fire also demonstrates how scapegoating fails. Blaming marginalized groups may temporarily redirect anger, but it corrodes moral authority and deepens division. Nero's persecution of Christians did not restore trust. It accelerated collapse and strengthened the very movement he sought to destroy. Finally, the Great Fire reminds us that memory outlives monuments. Nero rebuilt Rome in stone, but history rebuilt his legacy in words. The city recovered, the empire endured, and Christianity rose, but the fire remained fixed in collective consciousness as a warning. When modern societies speak of leaders fiddling while Rome burns, they invoke more than a metaphor. They recall a moment when leadership failed to meet crisis, when spectacle replaced responsibility, and when power lost legitimacy under pressure. That is why the Great Fire of Rome still matters. It is not merely ancient history. It is a case study in how civilizations are tested and how they are judged. Today, you heard the story of a city that burned, but that is not the real tragedy. You heard how Rome fell into flames, how Nero lost the trust of his people, how fear created scapegoats, and how violence failed to erase belief. The true lesson of the Great Fire of Rome is this. Fire disaster does not destroy civilizations. Bad leadership does. Firepower without responsibility collapses under pressure. Fire, you can burn buildings, but you cannot burn ideas. Nero rebuilt Rome with stone and gold, but history rebuilt his legacy with judgment. Christians were meant to disappear in fire, yet they emerged stronger, united, and remembered. This story teaches us that leaders are judged most harshly not in success, but in crisis. That scapegoating never heals a wounded society, and that memory is stronger than force. The Great Fire of Rome reminds us why we still say, fiddling while Rome burns. If you felt the weight of this history, if you understood its meaning, then this channel is for you. Because on History Teller YT, we don't just tell dates and events. We tell the human stories behind history's greatest moments. Thank you for watching. Remember the past, question power, and come back again, because history always has another story to tell.